Hi guys, this is MJ of Tert Fi, and in today's video, I'm happy to have one of our guests, an INTJ, and so meet AsuraPsych, and he'll introduce yourself in a bit.
My name's Chris. I run the YouTube channel Asura Psych. I'm a psychology graduate student, and I've been working with personality type for about 6 years as a practitioner. Yeah, that's about it.
Okay, so for today's video, I'm going to be asking him 16 questions, and the first 8 questions will come from me, and the last 8 questions will be coming from you guys who answered my questions on my poll on Instagram, which you can also follow at MBTI time. So if you want to follow Azura, I'll put his links in my descriptions below. So my first question is, how has type helped you in your life? If you can walk us briefly on how you learned about typology.
So I kind of just stumbled on to type around like 2014, 2015. I happened to pick up the book Gifts Differing one day. Because in high school we took the written MBTI. That was back in like 2011, so it's been a long while now. And I remember like hearing about it. We talked about it a little bit, and I just kind of dropped it for a few years, and it came into my mind a few years later, so I thought about it again, and then I went and got the book because I wanted to have good source material. Just started reading about it, and then in 2016 I liked it so much that I went and got the certification program, and type was actually kind of my entryway into psych. So I did my typology certification, and then I went and got a degree in psychology, instead of like the other way around. And type's been useful for me because it's just a good tool, a good philosophy, I think, for helping us understand other people and ourselves. And then I think most importantly, like how you can communicate meaningfully and effectively with other people. So when it comes to like relationships or, friendships, if you can find out where the wires are crossing, where the problems are using a model like, MBTI, then you can alleviate some of those problems.
Has it significantly improved your relationships and, for example, your way of living, the kind of career you decided to pursue? Or would you think life would have been somewhat the same? Like, how many people still, were able to live life not knowing so much about, oh, I'm an INTJ. I have known some people who learned type later on in life. And do you think there's an advantage to those who simply knew early on and those who found out like much, much later in life?
I think there can be, because as I mentioned, I think of type as more of like a philosophy than like a pure actual representation of like how we are and who we are. So a lot of times people out there can come to the same conclusions as type without needing type as a model to do that. Like, oh, I understand that I'm a logical person and that person's less logical, and therefore if I'm cautious with what I say in regards to how I say it, it might be easier for us to communicate. But I do think that those people who do have that framework are going to have an easier time, especially like identifying other people, to then quickly come to those conclusions and be able to, interact more meaningfully at a better pace.
Okay, that's actually an interesting view, because I think though there are advantages, I've also seen some disadvantages in knowing about these things early on. One of which I think is that we end up kind of putting people in boxes, and then we just put them there, expect them to act a certain way, and then we end up not really trying to change or become better people, because we kind of just identify with what we've seen or read or what we see in the memes. So
Right.
I think coming from that, what are your perceived disadvantages to learn to knowing or understanding type theories?
Yeah. So that's a good point actually. The type in and of itself is a tool, and an axe can cut down a tree, but it can also kill someone. And that's the same kind of mindset you have to adopt when you're thinking about something like personality type, is that it's all in how you use it. If you use it responsibly, if you understand that the system isn't meant to just put people in boxes, but instead just give you a framework for how to better understand yourself and others, then you're going to have a better time adapting it. But you're absolutely right. There's tons of people in the MBTI community, especially people who are newer, teenagers tend to really jump into stuff like MBTI. People who are into like astrology and stuff, who like the kind of categorical, like predestined, this is who you are style of thinking, that sometimes can be problematic as well. But it really is just how you think about it, how you use it, and having good sources out there online to teach MBTI theory in a way that isn't going to promote those stereotypes is, I think, is really important.
What are your thoughts on the validity with the controversy surrounding, MBTI, especially you studying psych? To my understanding, not a lot of people in the academia do not really support or advocate for it. Like they would lean towards the big five than MBTI. And I don't even know what their stance on Young. So if you would like to go into it.
Right. It's a difficult conversation because academia is like 7 steps removed from where we are in terms of what we're talking about with MBTI. So you and I, when we're talking about MBTI, we're talking about Jungian type theory. We're talking
Yeah.
about cognitive functions. And then there's the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the actual assessment that is formally administered by the Myers-Briggs Association. And that doesn't measure functions. That purely only measures dichotomies and their splits. And the validity of that assessment is all right. It's okay. It's not the best in the world. That's why scientists prefer Big Five, because they look at something like MBTI and they look at something like Big Five and they're like, well, Big Five just does better in every regard for what it is intending to measure in that realm. But that assessment doesn't measure function, so it's kind of useless to someone like you or me. It's like it really just doesn't help. So that's why there's such a big disconnect, and that's why you see people like Dario Nardi who tried to be like, okay, maybe there is something in the realm of functions that we can measure or talk about scientifically. I'm in the school where I don't even think it needs to be a science to be useful, which is why I constantly refer to type as a philosophy, because I think that if you just apply it to your life, you'll get meaning out of it. It doesn't need to be a one-to-one reflection of reality to be helpful, to be useful.
Okay. So how would you answer somebody who tries to debate or have a discussion with you and saying that MBTI is just somewhat similar to astrology? Would you actually think that they're of the same area or level even? Do you think that astrology has some kind of well, this is a bit deeper than what I'd like to go for, but like do you think astrology has some relationship with Young and then MBTI?
Jung was interested in stuff like astrology for thematic and abstract reasons, but not for any sort of like predetermined, destiny, that sort of thing.
Okay.
I'm probably going to make astrology people mad here, but when you look at astrology from like the scientific perspective, there's no validity, there's no reliability. And when you look at something like MBTI, where you can get in the 0.6, 0.7 ranges with the ability to reproduce scores and test results, like that's still not Big Five where you're getting those 0.8s, 0.9s, and that's what the scientists are looking for. But it's enough to be like, okay, there's something here. If out of 10 times, 7 times this person's getting the same result, there's something there. Where if you do something like astrology and you get someone to try and guess someone's astrological sign, you're going to get maybe 1 lucky guess out of 10 sometimes. There's not going to be any consistency in the results. And that's where the disconnect is between, because the people who like the Big Five in science, I think they're arguing in bad faith when they call MBTI something like astrology, because they're kind of grouping two things that aren't similar together.
In my research, I saw that MBTI is actually advocating for studying Young's work. And in Merv Emre's book, she talked about the history of MBTI, and it was born out of a time where people or women had no place in psychology, and that's why usually when I try to explain it to people, they did not have any formal training when they came up with this. It was inspired largely by Young's work, but it seems to check out. Like at the end of the day, this is like the Coke versus the Pepsi of like Coke being MBTI and then Pepsi being the Big Five, right? So it's kind of like the divide that I'm seeing, and people are always just people who don't really advocate for or believe in MBTI think that there isn't enough empirical research that supports it. And you mentioned about how it doesn't really need scientific backing for it to be useful to you, and that's why you refer to it as a philosophy. But I've seen that there are people who actually did some research on the validity of MBTI.
Oh, yeah.
Why hasn't it reached to the point of like, hey, this is actually good, it works. So why is it like that? Is it because of its history? Is it because it was rooted in, people who just came up with something like this without having gone to school for it? Is it hard to validate something like this?
It's hard to validate it. a type system in general because your consistency is always going to be less than a system that isn't type-based. So like if you have someone who scores the 51st percentile of extroversion, but then they score the 49th percentile of the next score, they're no longer an extrovert, which makes the scores less consistent. Whereas if you look at Big Five, if someone scores 51st percentile and then they score 49th percentile, they go, wow, we're only 2% apart. This is great. Look how consistent our results are. So it's this kind of like double standard in terms of like how consistent those results are and how they're going to view those results. There is also a degree, because people will say, oh, they weren't psychometrically trained. And I go, yeah, well, nobody was. It was like the 20s. And psychology as a formal science didn't even begin until 1880s. Like literally, like there was no psychology labs in the world until the 1880s, and then 30 years later, someone came up with a theory, and we're still talking about way before the internet, like way before these sorts of things. This person came up with this system, this typology, brought it to scientific academies and universities, got them to accept it, and then administered it nationally in the 50s. Like that's a huge deal for someone way before the age of the internet. I think that's something that is underestimated or undervalued when we look at the history of the MBTI.
Yeah, actually, that's why I always encourage people to look to its history and why it has survived the test of time. At least for me. There's a lot we don't know and where it originated, and even the origins of Enneagram, which is an entirely different discussion, is not it's widely accepted, but still its origins are actually still even debatable and questionable to many people. But coming from everything that we've talked about, you graduated with a degree in psychology and now pursuing a master's in it. Um, why is it seemingly uncommon for INTJs to get into this field, and why did you in the first place?
Yeah, well, it's kind of difficult because I see other INTJs in like the psychological sciences, but a lot of them like stayed closer to the science side, like the quantitative or the neuroscience or those sorts of things. They don't typically go into like the clinical or therapy side of
Mhm.
things. Where I mean, I think for me it was just because I was inspired by people like Jung, and I like the idea of like helping people one on one. But also you get to work with people who have interesting lives, interesting things that you can learn from. I think most of Jung's greatest insights came from case studies, is that he didn't learn much from being in labs. He learned a lot of what he saw from working with patients and then observing the patterns in those people. And then he wrote about those. And I think that is something that I'd like to do personally in the future as well.
Okay. So I think somewhat in relation to what you said, you have tertiary FI. So very often you do get the stereotype of being cold and detached. How do you cope, or how do you manage, or how do you improve that side of being an INTJ when it comes to dealing with people, when you coach them? Sometimes TE can come across as abrasive and direct, this is the problem, this is how you solve it. But like, how do you become more empathic or caring in your line of work, especially you deal with people?
Right. I think it comes from patience, really, because INTJs are kind of infamous for being able to immediately notice when something's wrong and then just point it out. And then they get frustrated when other people don't notice those things. So for the INTJ to like not be the jerk in the situation, they have to learn that like these things don't come as naturally to other people. And also because they like to say things first, a lot of the time they're wrong.
Mhm.
INTJs are very likely to sometimes be wrong just because they get an intuitive perception. They're like, oh, this is the best tool, let me use it. And then they're not actually stopping to think about it. They're not like the TI types who are going to like process that for like 30 minutes and then be like, okay, maybe now we'll do something with it. It's like, no, 2 minutes in, we've started acting. And then we'll adjust along the way as the situation requires. So I think for INTJs to improve their FI, they have to learn to develop patience with their TE, to not immediately just bulldoze everyone that they come across.
Okay, that's very interesting because that's actually tied to my next question, which is, um, can you give advice to how INTJs can respond to detours, especially when things don't go the way they planned or how they have predicted it? Because I think a lot of NI people, whether INFJ or INTJ, are very confident in their predictions. Like, oh, I just know, and I'm always right. Very often I'm right. And you just said something that's the opposite. So that might seem controversial to some people who are very confident that I know what's gonna happen. I just know, and I'm always almost right. So How do you respond to that?
Right. So other people aren't always wrong, even if they don't have the insights that you have. And so it can be very tempting for intuitives, any intuitive, dominant type especially, to be like,
Mhm.
I've seen a way that isn't done before, or I've seen a way that's different, so therefore this must be the right way. And that in and of itself is like a logical fallacy. Like you can't just assume just because it's the way that nobody else sees that it's right. Um, but unfortunately, that's what INTJs like to latch onto, because if they've seen that, then it's like, oh, look at this interesting thing that I can pursue that might be unique or novel to me. And then, of course, that typically gets tied into their FI identity over time, and they kind of
Mhm.
double down on it. But it really just boils down to like not latching too hard onto the ideas as you get them, and learning to process them and see if they actually are consistent and make sense with time.
Okay. I have a question though. Like, do you have someone whom you um ask or consult regarding your decisions or intuition? Or do you very often make independent decisions? It's like, do you have a friend or a partner or a mentor who's like, do you think what I'm thinking is right or my decisions are right? Or is it very often just you talking and having a conversation with yourself?
Me having a conversation with myself. I almost never question my own ethics or goals. I feel completely confident in who I am and the decisions that I am making, but I am also the first person to acknowledge if I've messed up or strayed away from the goal that I want.
Mhm.
So I'm very hard on myself if I don't live up to the standard that I am setting for myself, but I don't question, or I don't need others' opinions or advice regarding that.
All right. So I think my next question will be about what do you consider a meaningful and a successful life as an INTJ?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Well, I've always said that, like, for me, the idea of like, you know, if I could have something written on my tombstone, that'd be like, made a contribution to the field of psychology that lasted more than like a day. Like just, something memorable in the field, some sort of change, or I don't want to use the word discovery because I feel like discovery is kind of a weird word for psychology, but some way of thinking that helped, people accomplish their goals, that helped people do what they want to do. I think people sometimes underestimate the INTJ because they think of them as like not being interested in helping other people. But it's not that INTJs don't like to help people. It's that when they are helping them, it's to achieve something. It's because
Mhm.
RTE wants to like give that advice to other people. So it's like you can also achieve, you can also reach new heights, and I can show you how to do that through my NI insight. So to me, a meaningful life is being able to give people that insight so that they can do something productive or useful with it and achieve their own goals.
Okay, that's actually a nice answer. And I do wish that a lot of more people will be able to do the same, especially when they recognize that just because being an IT doesn't mean that you can't um participate in helping society in other ways other than like sending people to the moon, you know.
Right.
So I guess my next question will be how has FI helped you learn to integrate your other functions and as you go through life? Because I think a lot of people talk about NI a lot, and TE is very evident. It's there. You have SE. But for FI, how do you think that it helped you?
Yeah, well, FI has helped me and hindered me at times because it always is something that I have to act in accordance to.
Mm-hmm.
Where like I can't, if I have a feeling that I shouldn't do something, or like it would be wrong or immoral to do something, I won't do it. And even if it's sometimes to my benefit that I should be doing that thing. So with those middle two functions, it's kind of like TE and FI are always in a fight with each other. Where it's like I can see the perfect optimal thing to do, but FI is like, well, this doesn't abide by our moral code.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to constantly make those decisions of like, is this the right thing to do? So back in like January, for example, inflation was starting to hit really hard. And I was like, optimally, I could raise the prices on my typing session and it would make sense, but I would feel bad for doing it because I don't want to be that kind of person who turns type into another thing where it's like, oh, you have to charge some obscene crazy amount of money to get a session with somebody. So, that's an example of those kind of conflicts that happen frequently with FI for me.
You said that it hindered you sometimes, and then you talked about how you kind of check in on FI if you even if you make the decisions, and sometimes it makes sense to make these decisions, but like what do you think is something that very often people misunderstand about FI? Because very often like FE users describe FI as selfish, but the very thing that you talked about is very selfless of you. So how would you actually maybe distinguish the two? Because it's a very common
Right.
theme.
So the FI person isn't doing it for anyone else. Like when I talk about the idea of like not raising my prices, it's not because and of course I do care about other people, but it's more so because it would make me feel worse as a person to me.
Mhm.
Like it's not, I'm not, no one else could judge me. I'm immune to the judgments of others in regards to that situation. Your moral judgments are not going to impact me regarding that
Mhm.
situation. I would be judging myself in that situation. And that is the thing that I don't want. I don't want to judge myself negatively based on the moral action that I've made. So I think for the FI types, there's this fear that they have to kind of live with the person they've become if they do bad things. And that's going to be more impactful than if they, did something that might be upsetting to someone else, for example, or someone they care about.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. Do you think that functions are inherently good or bad? Because people sometimes demonize certain functions, right? But what's your take on the functions? Are they, in my understanding, and when my belief is that the functions are neutral. But what do you think about
Yeah,
the function?
the functions are neutral, but you can find good and bad representations of any of them.
Mhm.
The bad version of NI is going to be like the obsessed villain in the movie who's got only one goal in mind and they're not going to stop and they're going to destroy everything in their path to get to that one thing. Then you've
Mhm.
got the good NI where it's like, okay, how can I help bring humanity forward with my insight? What can I do to kind of get us moving in that next goal? Then you've got stuff like good SI, where you've got automated systems and bureaucracies that help everybody get by and systematize things to a point where now you don't have to actually work. You can just be like, okay, the system's in place. Then you've got bad SI, where it's controlled to such a degree that nobody has freedom. So there's good and bads to every function. So I think you're
Mhm.
right in that it is more of a neutral thing. It's
Okay.
just how it comes out.
All right, good. So for my last question on my part, what are your thoughts on people who look for specific types to date? Do you think the type should be a huge factor in choosing a mate or even friendships, but like just in general?
I think it's not wrong to have like 3 to 4 types that are your preference. I think if you're looking for one specific type and you're not willing to settle, or not settle, but you're not willing to like consider anything else, that's a problem. But if you're someone who's like, I really like EP types, like
Mhm.
that's okay to be like, yes, I need someone in my life who's very energetic, active, and can get the party started. Like,
Mhm.
because I'm not that, or I am that, and I need someone who's like that. Like, it's okay to have a type when it comes to your romantic preferences. It's just I don't think that looking for one specific personality type is kind of a healthy mindset because you limit yourself so much. I never thought when I was younger that I'd be with an ENFJ, and then here I am, happy. So with that, so
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so thank you. So that's the first 8 questions that I have on my part, and now we're gonna go on into the other 8 questions that people want to know about INTJs.
sure.
And so the first question is that, what is one word that describes you and why?
I would say maybe focused is a good
Mhm.
word,
Mhm.
especially if I'm invested in something. I
Mhm.
tend to be laser focused. I tend to not be able to distract myself from that thing until I feel like I've achieved something that I want from that. And that can be a problem sometimes, and it's not consistent all the time.
Mhm.
I'm not 100% focused in every little single thing I do in my life, but one that is applied to the things that I'm interested in, I think it is to a degree where it is noticeable more than any of my other traits.
All right. Okay. So the second question is that, do you have to be cold and stoic to be a real INTJ?
No, but I think most are. Um, and I think INTJs can develop warmth, and I think that's something that is like it's either a skill that has to be developed or just like a personal thing.
Mhm.
INTJs are often quite warm with the people they care about. It's just that select few amount of people, that group is very small. Like they're not going to share that experience with more than probably like 2 or 3 people max at a time. in their life, and it's still difficult for them because FI is such a private thing for the INTJ. So I think most of them are going to come off as, aloof, detached, or even edgy at times.
Okay. Actually, another, I guess, in relation to that question, I think one underlying thing that might relate to that is they might be mistyped. So if you aren't cold and stoic, is it then possible that you're actually not an INTJ?
If you
Is it
aren't,
one is it one good thing to kind of look for? Because I have seen EPs who get INTJs because they have TE still, you have TE, and some people work as strategists. Like actually one of the people I was with is an ENFP, and then he kept getting INTJ, but he's super not an INTJ. So I guess is that one thing to kind of like look for, that like maybe you're not an INTJ if you're not cold
so
and
that
you're the opposite.
detachment should be present with most IJs. So I call
Mhm,
the IJs the observers. That's my own temperament that I call them. That's not official or anything. But I think
mhm,
that's because as introverted perceiving types, they naturally find themselves observing situations, processing information, and then making a decision off the information that they've processed.
mhm,
So more even like ISFJs, they're going to need some time to like sit on situations, and they're going to even be aloof at times. Because there's kind of a detachment from that immediate moment because there is that internal processing going on. But with INTJs, it's even INFJs, it's even more so because they have the NI as opposed to the SI. So not only are they disassociating from the moment, but they also don't even have like the sensing to like pay attention to what's going on. So they
mhm.
kind of just float off and detach.
Okay.
But I don't want to say it's impossible, but I think that most INTJs are going to have that kind of aloofness, detachedness to them.
Mhm. Okay. So I hope that helps whoever asked that question.
Right.
Um, okay, third question is, what's the best way to communicate with an INTJ? I guess how would you like to be approached?
Get to the point. Don't beat around the bush. Like, for example, like I have people on Discord sometimes who will propose like business ideas or something, and they'll lead it up with like 6 messages, like, "Hey, how you doing? Hey, I'm this person. I just wanted to talk to you about this, and I like your work and all of that." And it's like, no, just tell me what you want from me, and like I'm not going to be like offended by that. I'll give you a response to it, and the fact that you're building up all of this energy before that is not increasing the odds of you getting something from me. It's lowering them because now you're becoming a thorn in my side that I have to like deal with all this extra conversation. So if you want to approach an INTJ, especially if you like want something or you want to communicate with them, just be direct. It doesn't mean be a jerk. It just kind of means say what you what you mean and say what you want to say, and don't beat around the bush.
Okay. So maybe another way to answer this question is, if I'm interested in an INTJ, what's the best way to communicate with them? So not necessarily needing something like proposing a business idea or anything like that, but like I want to be friends with one or something.
Right. Okay. So that's another good perspective to take. It's going to be slightly similar. I think most INTJs are going to be most annoyed by people who waste their time because they're reserved, independent. They want to just have their own free time. They're selfish with time, I think.
Okay.
So if they're like doing something,
Mhm.
if you go up to an EP who's reading a book, they're usually happy to be like, "Oh, hey, what's going on? Like, let's have a conversation." Like because they can adapt to things as they happen in life. Whereas with IJs, it's like they're on a track, and if you divert them from that track, they have to like stop what they're doing, think about the situation, then go back onto it. Um, so just don't interrupt them. Be direct. Don't push them to express something if they're not ready.
Mm.
Like don't ask them about how do you feel about our friendship, like that sort of thing, if they're not at a state in the relationship where they don't feel like that's an appropriate question just yet, because there's a good chance they don't even know.
Mhm.
With having FI such a low slot, it's more like it's not that they don't want to give you an answer, it's that they haven't even processed that yet. So it's they're not lying to you, they're just like, I don't know, like I haven't thought about that, like I haven't even begun to process that.
Okay. 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 Now to the fourth question. How do INTJs cope with breakups? If you haven't been in that situation, then I guess something hypothetical, or maybe a broken friendship, something like that, something similar.
Right. I've personally have never been in that situation. Um, I have worked with people in coaching if had that situation. So there's kind of two sides to it, I've found. There's kind of like the obsessive INTJ who wants to get back with the person, and they spend a lot of energy kind of like trying to form their future into some way where they can get back to that person, almost like manipulating the strings of every situation so they can find themselves like talking to them, or this, that. Or they kind of do the opposite, where it's like they just completely detach, where it's just like, oh, okay, we're done, it's over now. Like, I don't have any attachment to the situation anymore. I don't want to be involved anymore. And of course, I feel like in reality, there should be a healthy middle ground between those two, but I don't see that healthy middle ground too often, being honest. I think most INTJs tend to fall into the extremes of like, okay, I'm either going to avoid this person completely, or no, I'm not over it yet, because their NI insight or their vision of the future involved this person in it, and now like that's cracking and breaking, and they have to kind of figure out what to do with that.
Oh, that's actually very interesting. I guess I'll tie it to the next question. So, do INTJs door slam people like INFJs? What do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think INTJs are more likely to just like, imagine you've got like a bridge between you and another person. The INFJ gets angry at someone and they burn the bridge. They're like, okay, now there's no more connection between me and that person. Where the INTJ just stops taking care of the bridge. They're just like, oh, it's getting rusty, it's getting dirty, whatever. I'm just not going to upkeep it. It's too much work, it's too much responsibility. So they just kind of walk away from that situation. They walk away from that bridge.
That's so interesting. I have actually noticed that with other INTJs that I know. Do you think that's a good thing? That they're kind of like, this isn't gonna serve me anymore. Um, it's not gonna be in the future that I foresee for myself, that they just not take care of it and like leave it.
Has positives and negatives, right? Because for the other person, it can sometimes feel like they've just been abandoned. They're like, okay, well, why is this person not talking to me anymore? But it also, I think, theoretically leaves the door open for the bridge to be crossed again in the future. Like, just because it's in bad condition doesn't mean you can't go and fix it later. Whereas with the INFJ, once that bridge is burned, it's very hard for them to want to go through all the work of building an entirely new bridge.
Okay, it's very interesting. So I guess the short answer is no, not similar to INFJs. Not the next question is that what is SE grip like for you?
Yeah, so it's, for me personally, it's always been it's always been food. Like if I find myself stressed, sad even, it's just like I kind of like eat. I had something stressful happen in my family last week, and my wife wasn't hungry. She was like, oh, I'm very sad, so I don't want to eat. But for me, it was like, I'm sad, I want to eat. So like I would go and like order an obscene amounts of food and then get a stomach ache right afterwards. So there is like the overindulging aspect, and then there's kind of like ignoring the sensory aspect to it. Whereas I find that as INTJs get more depressed and stressed, they tend to like forget about the basic sensory needs, like keeping up with their room or hygiene or these sorts of things. Maybe they go a few days without showering. And for them, that's usually typically unusual, because I feel like even the INTJs who are basement dwellers like to like have some sort of basic routine or schedule when it comes to like, keeping themselves clean, getting dressed, this sort of thing. But that starts to fade away as they become more stressed or fall into that grip state.
Do you also end up overworking? Is that part of your, SE grip as well? Do you like suddenly walk or go for a run for like 3 hours and just start editing videos for like 10 hours or something like that? Or not?
Yeah, I don't know if I would even call that a grip, because for sometimes that could be like a TE positive space for me. Like sometimes I'll record a video, and then I'll sit down to start editing it, and it'll like 6 hours will fly by, and I'll be like, oh, I wasn't even paying attention. Like just because I was in that mindset of like, I want to do this one thing, and then it goes on to the next thing, and then that kind of snowballs. So that doesn't even feel like as much of a grip state to me as it does more of like a better kind of like, oh, I'm being productive, like I'm doing something good.
Okay. Next question is, but this is a funny question. Are you always right and the other guy always wrong?
I wish I was always right. No, as I mentioned kind of earlier with TE likes to like pick up whatever looks the best in the moment and use that as its frame of reference for if something is like good or bad. But unfortunately, if the correct answer isn't in your eyesight, then you're picking up the wrong answer. So it's not uncommon for INTJs to be wrong in the moment, but a healthy INTJ should be able to recognize that, drop whatever logic they're using, and then switch to the more efficient one. Because that's the benefit of TE, is being able to be like, oh, I'm not attached to this logic. Introverted thinking is inherently attached to its own logic. It has subjective value to it. It's part of their identity. So when they decide that something is right logically, it's much harder for them to drop that in favor of something else unless there's overwhelming evidence. Whereas with TE types, it's like, okay, this thing's better. Bye. Let me take this one. Like, at least that's how it should be in the healthy TE user.
Okay. Well, I have another question following up to that. Have you personally acknowledged that you were wrong and admitted or apologized for it and like, you know what, I was wrong. Sorry, something like that. Have you ever been in such a situation?
Right. Yeah. And in fact, I would say all the time. And again, it goes back to this idea with TE where it's very common for be like, because TE it's forceful in its approach, but healthy TE should immediately back off if that's not the situation. So I'll be like, no, this is right. This is the thing. Look, I'll look it up. And then we look it up and it's wrong. It's like, okay, I was wrong. My bad. So there's been tons and tons of situations like that in my life where my NITE or immediately assume like, oh, this is the right thing. Here's the tool to fix your situation. But then as soon as I find out that's not right, I'm like, oops, bye. Okay, throw it out. Start over.
Okay, that's good then. And actually, that's something that a lot of INTJs or even ENTJs should be more mindful of or should apply in their life. Um,
Well, I
okay,
think
so
the real weakness with the INTJ isn't admitting that they're wrong. It's that because their vision can't be wrong is a different way to think of it. Like if an INTJ wants to do something, if they've seen the future for themselves, that's a subjective viewpoint and that can't be wrong. The tools to get there, the logic to get there can be changed and that can be as wrong as anything else. But INTJs are going to be exceptionally stubborn in the realm of whatever it is that they want to be doing personally.
okay, wait, I'm gonna ask more about this. But what about like their predictions about the future? Would you be able to say the same thing? Oh, you know how it Elon Musk. Oh, I
Yeah.
think the world, whatever, end up this way.
See, but when you look at the predictions, yeah, there's going to be those like short term, hey, look, I think this is going to happen sort of things, and those can be wrong because that's tied to a situation. But NI, I think, is more so about taking in this information to form a vision of the future that you want. Because NE is more about noticing what could be, and I is more about seeing what you want and then putting all the pieces together to figure out how you can get to that future. Because you're starting with an endpoint in mind, and then piecing together what it means for that future to exist.
Okay, I'll ask a bit more about this.
Sure.
How would you differentiate NI, confirmation bias, and self-fulfilling prophecies?
So I'm trying to think about if I'm understanding this. So how would I differentiate the three things together?
Yeah, so for example, oh, I think this is gonna happen versus I think it's gonna happen and I unconsciously will make it happen because I think I'm right that this is going to happen, and so you kind of go there. And self-fulfilling prophecies where you're fulfilling your own prophecies as you kind of mentioned earlier.
Right.
Which
I think
then
INFJs are slightly more prone to like subconsciously moving things towards a goal. Where it's like, this is the future that will happen. And then like every day they kind of do something small that will push towards that. And then they're like, aha, look, I was right. And it's like, yeah, you've spent the past year making sure that it'll happen. Whereas with the INTJ, it's more like, yes, this is what I think is going to happen, or more so, this is what I want to happen. And I'm going to openly, publicly use all of my resources to make sure that I can get to this thing that I want. So it is a self-fulfilling prophecy in both cases. It's just, I think with the INTJs, it's more forceful or acknowledged even, where the INFJs almost have more of that kind of like prophetic aspect to them, where it's like, I told you it would happen. Look at how much insight I have.
okay.
Does that make sense?
It does somehow. I'm just curious rather, as to which functions do you think attribute to that distinguishes the way you predict things and the way, say, an INFJ predict things.
Right, because an INFJ inherently has a need to understand their visions. So when they have an NI insight, there's kind of like this TI doubling down on like a need to understand why that vision's come to be, but unfortunately that leads them to be a type that's very much not prone to action. Whereas when you look at the INTJ, they get their NI inside, and then TE is kind of like the immediate thing that comes to mind. So they put their external resources and logic together to try and achieve that result. So INFJs will kind of they'll refine their own vision more, I think, into something that makes sense not only from the perspective of their intuition, but from their logic as well. And then they're like, aha, I've seen what will most likely logically happen because of my ability to easily see patterns tied with my understanding of logic. And then INTJs, their NI is more personal because it's attached to FI. It's like an ego thing almost. So their visions are less about like what is more likely to happen and more likely like this is what I as an individual based on my feelings want to happen.
Mhm.
It's almost like a twisted version of looking into the future, because you can look into the future, but you're not getting an objective viewpoint, because intuition's NI is inherently subjective. It's inherently not objective. So when
Yeah.
the introverted intuitive type who also has introverted feelings sees a future that they want, then their FI latches to it. Then it's like, now it's a future that I want, that I've seen for myself. How can I make this happen?
Okay. Actually, I think the same way. I always tell people when it arises in a conversation how just because you're an NI dom or a TI dom doesn't mean that there's no subjectivity to your beliefs. Because I feel like it's in a neutral state and it get influences by your own subjectivity and how you view things. So when people say that, oh, I'm such a logical, objective person, well, actually, I argue against it because it's like you think you are, but there are a lot of things that influences the way you think right now, and it may not be apparent to you. And even if it's based on facts, your facts can be wrong and can be subjective also, or could be inaccurate or something like that. So that's anyway, that's just a nice thing to hear. Um, the last question from people is that why are you cold? I'm tired of starting every conversation.
I think it's just that INTJs don't get much out of like the normal social stuff.
Mhm.
And it's not that they can't be social, because, you ask my wife, I can be on Discord and talk with a friend for like 5 hours at a time and laugh and have a good time. But the
Mhm.
difference is like that wouldn't be easy for me to do outside of something like Discord in like a normal social situation where there's kind of like energy that has to be spent to upkeep like, your facial appearance or how you're acting or these sorts of things. So I think it's just that INTJs burn out much quicker than the other types. And therefore, when they are cold, it's almost like they're preserving energy to save for when they need it. They're like bears who are hibernating. So in the rare scenario where they have to spend energy, then they have it.
Okay. So I know that I said 16 questions, but I feel like I've gone past that. So I'll ask more.
That's fine.
I've heard, I think it's an objective person. I don't know. Have you heard of objective personality or opiate? Okay.
Yep.
Do you think that there are people who do use certain functions more than others? For
Each
example,
referring to like their jumper system.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I've talked about this and like made videos even on this topic. I don't think that the jumper system is inherently wrong, but I think from a traditional Jungian standpoint, we would view it as a developmental stage as opposed to its own distinct type. So in my opinion, it's perfectly normal to have an INTJ who's kind of like NI-FI focused, but that is
Mhm.
something that can change throughout the lifespan and isn't its own distinct type. And that if you purely reinforce that in them, then you're teaching them that it's okay, like not to use TE as that kind of bridge function to like help them engage with the external world.
Okay, makes sense. Um, that's something I'll think about more, but yeah. So there, that actually concludes the 16 questions. Really
16,
had
yeah.
fun. 16 questions, so many sub questions, but yeah, I had a lot of fun, and thank you so much again for taking the time to sit
Yeah, for
down
sure.
and have a chat with me and answer all of these questions. Again, guys, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to Chris's channel, Asura Psych. So yeah, thank you so much for watching our video. So thank you. Bye.
Bye.